Tractate Nedarim discusses the laws of vows, referred to as a neder, essentially a verbal declaration, usually to make something forbidden to you, which has legal significance. Chapter 1 will begin the discussion on the laws of taking vows upon yourself. The first Mishnah says, any other equivalent terminology for a vow functions the same as a typical vow. Any other equivalent terminology for a cherem, a type of vow, functions the same as a typical cherem. Any other equivalent terminology for an oath functions the same as a typical oath, and any other equivalent terminology for a Nazirite vow functions the same as a typical Nazirite vow. For instance, if somebody says, I am vowed from you, or I am separated from you, or I am distanced from you in that which I eat of yours, or that which I taste of yours, despite the slightly unique wording in these cases, it still functions as a valid vow. If somebody says, I am detached from you, Rabbi Akiva had a doubt as to if this is a valid vow, but he ruled stringently. The Gemara says, it taught all the different types of vows and oaths, as vows and oaths are taught about together in the Torah, so it also taught about all the other types of vows here too. And I mentioned Charomim first, as that similar to vows is a vow where you prohibit an item to yourself, unlike by an oath where you prohibit yourself to an item. Further, oddly, the Mishnah said it would list equivalent terminologies of vows, but those that it listed aren't equivalent terminologies. Those are brought later. The ones it brought here are partial declarations, so it's explained that it actually meant to say also partial declarations, and it taught those first here, as they were mentioned last by the preface, which is something done in many Mishnahs, and it gives several examples. It also gives some examples of Mishnahs where the first clause of the preface is actually spoken on first, but those are explained to be Mishnahs with many different clauses, so by those it explains the first one first. However, it cites more examples to prove that's not true, so it actually suggests that sometimes it just decides to discuss the first clause first, and sometimes, like by our Mishnah, it decides to discuss the second clause first. Alternatively, it said that when listing the preface, it said the actual biblical concept first, and then in the discussion it discussed the concept of partial declarations first, as those are derived from scriptural exposition. However, others disagree and say that the equivalent terms aren't even of biblical origin at all, so in the end it says, when we said to slot in the preface of partial declarations, it actually meant that we should slot them in first. It also describes the scriptural exposition that sources the laws of partial declarations, which are discussed. This is further described, and it also says a source, which states that if somebody who took a Nazirite vow, swearing off wine, grapes, and other things, if he violates his vow, he's done 2 transgressions, for violating his vow and for consuming wine. There's also a prohibition against delaying the fulfillment of a vow, which can apply to a Nazir if he vows to become a Nazir before dying, at which point he's immediately obligated to become a Nazir from that point onward. It cites proofs from related cases. Another instance of one who takes a Nazirite vow violating the principle to not delay, a Nazir cannot become impure, in addition to not drinking wine. So he violates the principle of not delaying if he takes his Nazirite vow while he's inside of a graveyard. Even if you say his vow doesn't take effect immediately, he's delaying it by staying in an impure place. By the way, this also teaches that if an actual Nazir intentionally becomes impure, he transgresses the prohibition against delaying. Another way a Nazir can delay, on top of not becoming impure or drinking wine, a Nazir is required to cut his hair and bring some offerings when the time of his Nazirite vow is over. So he can also delay doing either of those. There's further discussion on this point. In regards to the partial declarations mentioned, if somebody says, I am vowed from you, or separated from you, some say if he adds the ending part of, in that which I eat of yours, he's forbidden to benefit from the other guy, but the other guy can benefit from him. If he just said the first part, neither of them can benefit from each other. This is debated from other sources where such specificity of wording is not recognized. Instead, it suggests that he needs the second part of the statement about food for it to be an effective vow, as these partial declarations are vague, and when he says, I am vowed from you, that could just mean I won't speak to you, or when he says, I am separated from you, that could just mean I won't do business with you, that kind of thing. This would mean this opinion holds that inconclusive partial declarations are invalid in accordance with other opinions, and we bring sources. Whether inconclusive partial declarations are valid is actually debated by others, although some would actually hold that they are effective, besides for by a divorce document, which is debated over. The validity of these points is debated from other sources. It also debates if a partial declaration is valid by a betrothal, or peya, a type of field charity, based on its comparisons to other cases. They're left unresolved. It asks if there's validity to partial declaration by charity, or to nullify your ownership of something, which is debated if it's different than charity, legally, at least. Also, if there's validity to a partial declaration of designating an area as a restroom, and these are also left unresolved. In regards to Rabbi Akiva's doubt regarding the I am detached from you, he ruled stringently on the doubt, so there wouldn't be a punishment of lashes if you violated such a vow. Others debate this point, and it mentions some laws of excommunication. If excommunication is done in somebody's presence, it must be annulled in their presence. If it wasn't done in their presence, it can be annulled with or without his presence. Some say if somebody hears a man say God's name in vain, they must excommunicate that man, and if he doesn't, then he himself should be excommunicated. This is because saying God's name in vain leads to poverty. There are instances of this brought. It also says the sage can excommunicate himself, and he's allowed to annul his own excommunication. There's an instance of this by a sage who would always excommunicate himself before excommunicating somebody else, and then he would nullify both the excommunications. There are other teachings that says you're allowed to swear to perform a mitzvah. It says a person who says he will get up early to study a chapter, or that he will study a tractate, has vowed a great vow. You can fulfill the oath from Mount Sinai to study Torah by saying the Shema prayer every morning and night. It also says if a person tells a person they should arise early and study a chapter, then he must do the same also. Further, if somebody had a dream that he was excommunicated, he must have it annulled before 10 people who at least study Gemara. And if he can't find 10 of such people, he should at least get 10 people who study Mishnah. And if he can't find those, he should wait until he gets 10 who can study Gemara. And in the meanwhile, he should sit at a crossroads and greet people who will respond, "Peace be with you," to keep himself safe. You must still do all of this even if he knows who excommunicated him in the dream, as while that man he dreamed about was an agent to excommunicate him, perhaps that man wasn't an agent to annul his excommunication. If in the dream the excommunication was also annulled, you can't rely on that, as serious dreams do also have some nonsense mixed in. There are examples of such instances occurring. It also says a single expert sage can annul excommunication, and it lists points on the importance of not saying God's name in vain. New Mishnah. Further examples of partial declarations: if somebody says, like the vows of the wicked, meaning like a casual vow, whether to become a Nazir, or to bring an offering, or for an oath, that's an effective vow. If he says, like the vows of the virtuous, it's not a valid vow. If he said, like the Nedava of the virtuous, which is a specific type of vow, this is valid, be it to become a Nazir or to bring an offering. The Gemara says, regarding if he says, like the vows of the wicked, he needs to add am I, as long as there's an actual Nazir there right in front of him. Upon me, to bring an offering, or from it I shall not eat, for an oath, for it to be valid for those vows. There are further points. It gives the difference between a vow, which is said by some to just not be done at all, and an adava, which is a proper thing, either as that's done to vow the consecration for an animal specifically right before it's offered, so that way it won't be misused, or by a Nazirite vow taken with full sincerity, like by an instance where it says a man was extremely handsome, so he took a Nazirite vow to remove his hair so that way he wouldn't come to sin. There are further points on this list, and there's additional discussion on this. New Mishnah: if a person takes a vow to bring an offering, a karban, it's still valid if he says equivalent definitions like the word konam, konach, or konas instead of the word karban. That's a valid substitute for the word. Similarly, if he says cherek, cherech, or cheref, this is valid instead of the word cherem. If he says nazik, naziach, or paziach, these are valid instead of the Nazirite vow. If he says shavusa, shekuka, or the vow of Mohi, which is a way of saying Moshe, this is valid instead of an oath. The Gemara disputes the sources for all these terminologies, and it discusses the validity of various other specific terminologies. New Mishnah: if somebody vows in reference to a person's food that to him it's not unconsecrated, not kosher, not clean or pure, impure, leftovers of an offering, or rejected food from an offering, he's invalidated himself from eating the food. If he says the food should be like a designated lamb, an animal kept in a temple enclosure, like an animal designated for the temple fire, like on the altar, like from the heichal in the temple, like offerings in Jerusalem, or referencing any of the altar accessories, even if he didn't mention a specific offering, it's considered a vow to designate something as an offering. Others say if he says it should be like in Jerusalem, he hasn't said anything. The Gemara further debates these points as to the authorship of this Mishnah. This is further discussed, along with some additional points. It goes through other terminology which encompasses broader concepts in regards to vows, like the inclusion of teruma from certain phrases and similar, and the other terminologies are also qualified. New Mishnah: saying karban, or any of the specific types of temple offerings, ola, mincha, chatas, toda, or shlamim, and then he says, that which I eat of yours, he can't eat the food, but others say he can, as he needed to say, like a karban specifically. If somebody says the karban, or like a karban, or just karban, and then that which I eat of yours, he can't eat the person's food. If he said to a karban, I shall not eat of yours, some say he can't eat of their food. The Gemara further qualifies these points. New Mishnah: if somebody says konam, my mouth speaking to you, or my hand working with you, or my foot walking with you, That's a valid vow of prohibition. The Gemara says, as vows are only really applicable by things which have substance, he must be vowing against the person's mouth, hands, or feet which have substance, and it brings sources. And that's the end of chapter 1.